First of all, thank you very much, RUSI. Thank you, Tom, for Standard Chartered's opportunity to host the first panel this morning. I'm very honored to be here with some distinguished voices from the industry. I'm sure many of you know who is on the stage here, but I'll start with Tracey McDermott, former regulator and the former Chief Compliance Officer of Standard Chartered. Then Dr. Sue Hawley, Executive Director, Spotlight on Corruption. Andrea Rowe, Director of Specialist Markets for Financial Conduct Authority. And Justin Baldacchino, Managing Director, Supervision at DFSA, so Dubai regulator. Thank you very much. So yes, this morning we're going to look at, as the opening panel, finance and security, so the evolution over the past 10 years, the past decade. I won't spend a lot of time giving an overview of what's happened over the past decade. I know many of you are familiar, but I did want to just touch on some of the key trends that we're seeing just to set the backdrop for the conversation that we will be having in terms of what we've done over the past 10 years. So I think we're all aware of significant trends and how they're impacting national security. So cybercrime, cybersecurity threats used as a tool of convenience for state-sponsored action to undermine national security, the evolution of financial services tools, so for example, cryptocurrencies as new avenues, and as an industry response to that, the need to balance financial innovation, but also the much needed requirement for the industry to be ready to address the increased complexity in tracking financial crime. Fraud has certainly evolved from direct attacks on individuals to sophisticated schemes that are targeting not just individuals, but governments and organizations alike. Trade-based money laundering, and again, being able to use some of the new financial innovation. We're seeing increasing complexity of global trade networks hindering detection. One piece that I spoke to someone about this morning, very concerning about modern slavery. So we're seeing an incredible amount of scam centers are on the rise and may increasingly require governmental task force to address, simply to bring victims home. So if I look just briefly to sum up the three areas that we are seeing that are putting pressure on the system. So the evolution of criminality, the evolving nature, the ability of criminals to be incredibly agile using tools like the darknet, deep fakes, recruitment schemes that would impress global organizations, and also money laundering as a service. And we all know what happens when you outsource key activities. You can focus on your core activities. And so that is a very concerning development. Geopolitics and the New World Order, we touched on that a little bit this morning. That's reshaping dynamics at a time when we are seeing all of this pressure on evolution, the need to keep pace with technology, but the financial services tools being used increasingly as a response to security, which is creating pressure on the system. So again, you're looking at, as a regulator, as a bank, as a fintech, your ability to be able to address to the current threats, but also evolve your technology and predict the future threats. Much has been done. So I think there's been an incredible response across the industry over the past decade. But again, it's coming at a time where we're seeing industrial policy, which is driving data privacy and sovereignty concerns. So in some instances, we're becoming more nationalistic as a world. But there has been, off the back of enforcement, incredible investment. Tom spoke a little bit about his experience at JP. Myself and Justin were there at the time, and some of the compliance organization that were a pain in the butt, but hopefully we're part of the solution. And then that level of investment that's needed to address the threat ultimately, and someone spoke to this morning, it's not producing the returns. So what we need to focus on is global collaboration. Countries cannot tackle global crime without cooperation, and so we've seen some of this rise through public-private partnerships and the absolute importance of doing more of that, but the complexity that underlies that in terms of working not just with your allies, but more broader than that, the technology, the legislation, all of those changes that are required to really make an impact. Okay, I hope that wasn't too doom and gloom, but there's a lot going on. So now I'm going to open up to my distinguished panel. So the first question. So over the past decade, how well have countries balanced their national security objectives with this ever-increasing need for international cooperation in financial crime? What lessons have we learned when we look back? So, Andrea, if I can turn to you first.
Look, I think it's really important to reiterate the point that economic crime is a global issue. And it's a challenge because it knows no boundaries. And it's important also to look at the criminals behind it. They are tough, they're innovative, they're quick, they're always ahead of the game. And I think in that context, it's very important to look at the importance of international cooperation and its need to continue to thrive. And so with that context, I think when we look at whether or not, I think the question you've asked is, where are we in terms of the approach that the UK is taking? I think that the UK has taken a balanced approach. I think the UK is well organised. It has a cross-systemic approach. It is responsive to emerging threats and risks, and it also targets priority areas. Also within the system, to your point, Wendy, international relationships and domestic relationships are key to that. Also within that framework, in terms of the FCA and the work that we do, we work very closely with international supervisors, intelligence and law enforcement, and cross-border firms. But we also engage with our international partners to set the right global standards for cross-border products and services. And in that context as well, I think it's important to note the work of FATF and other international organizations like IOSCO, because they play a key role in setting international standards to tackle both national and global risks. And I think over the last 10 years, if we look at the work that FATF has done, it has made tremendous progress, I think, in terms of the work it's done on crypto and also on the virtual asset services providers. I think there's always going to be a challenge for the UK to ensure that technical standards are translated into effectiveness. And we've already touched on the point that I think there's going to be a continuous challenge, particularly around increasing international isolationism. And I think that again reiterates even more the importance of joined up international collaboration, where not only are we sharing ideas, we are being more curious, we are being creative in how we share information and intelligence. And I think it's the only way that we're going to challenge the organised crime groups and the criminals behind it. And I think finally, just in terms of the UK response, with the FATF mutual evaluation upcoming in 2027, I think it really presents an opportunity for the UK to present its successes and the achievements over the past 10 years. And of course, it's also the opportunity to see and receive constructive suggestions to further development going forward.
Thanks, Andrea. Justin, do you want to give an ex-UK response?
I will. I guess, good morning, everyone. So from my perspective, for the last 10 years, I've spent a big part of my career in Australia, across APAC, and now in the Middle East. So a good perspective from that is that there definitely has been this push towards making sure that we do a better job at what we do. But as what was said earlier, there's a lot more work that's required going forward. So from a Middle East perspective, I'll work from there. We were actually put on the grey list in 2022. Now, being a regulator, we're quite concerned that we were going to see a retraction of a lot of entities actually not wanting to be there anymore because we were on the grey list. The positive for us, we actually didn't see any firms actually closing their offices, whereas in the past that was the case. And the reason for that is they understood that the UAE was promising to everyone that they would try and get off that grey list as quickly as possible. Now, they did get off that grey list within 2 years, which is a bit of a record, and I was on the ground to see what was actually done as part of that process. So in 2019, they changed the federal law. They separated out an FIU. They made sure the resources were dedicated to that FIU. And as part of that FIU, what that meant, and there was a huge amount of work, not only for the regulators across the UAE, but it was a huge amount of work also for the entities there. So we're able to see actually a big uplift in relation to the way firms were onboarding, how they were understanding their client sets, what sort of risk assessments were taking place, and what sort of business they were doing. And these were the questions that weren't really asked 10 years ago. Now, in saying that, I can give a good perspective because coming from Australia, people have a perception that Australia is ahead of the game, but it's actually not. It's way behind the game, and UAE from that perspective is way ahead. Good example I like to use all the time is only most recently in Australia, they changed the law to include DNFPPs. They didn't have that in the past. So now AUSTRAC is required to actually review not only 17,000 entities, but 90,000 entities going forward. And that's only happened in the sort of last couple of months. And that, again, is coming into effect quite shortly. So what we're seeing is this development, not only from an Australia UAE perspective, but even when we're in APAC. I think for us, as Wendy said earlier, I was at JP Morgan at the time, and what we took away from that is that when there was a restriction or an inability to do business, very quickly the banks were able to turn around and dedicate those resources. So if I think about my career, 20 years ago, for a big part of my career I was on the banking side, last 5 years as a regulator, seeing the huge amount of change in relation to that momentum. So when I worked in an Australian bank just over 10 years ago, most of the Australian banks only had roughly between 10 and 15 people from an AML perspective. Now those 10 or 15 people are almost 1,000 people. And we also saw that, Wendy and I saw that at JP Morgan when we first joined. I think it was roughly about 10 years ago. There was only, I think, about 80 people doing sort of compliance financial crime. By the time I left, which was a few years later, there was up to about 500 people. So there's huge amount of momentum that's going forward. And what we're seeing in the UAE, the fact that we got off the grey list is great. Unfortunately for us, we have a mutual evaluation taking place in 2026. So what we don't want to do is get back onto that grey list. So there's a huge amount of work in regards to doing that. But at the same time, it's making sure we coordinate with not only the standard setting bodies like Basel, IOSCO, FATF as well, but trying to make sure we push that momentum going forward and ensuring that we don't go back to where we were in 2022. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the second question, unless you want to. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I did want to just comment on this because I want to return us to the trough of existential despair after having heard quite upbeat from both Andrea and Justin, because I think if your question is, are we balancing national security and financial crime well, if we think our measure of success is, do we feel more secure now than we did 10 years ago, and do we think financial crime is less than 10 years ago, I think the answer is actually whatever we're doing. We might be balancing it well, but we're not getting the right outcomes. And I think when we look to the future, we can see that actually this is only going to get even more difficult, and that's because of the political and the technology environment we're operating in. So if we think about the politics, geopolitics is much more fragmented. Traditional allies are no longer feeling that they're obliged to side with one party or the other. We're seeing the middle powers move around. So these sort of strategic alliances are fraying and need to be reframed. We're also seeing the definition of what is national security really widened. So chips, cyber, yesterday's announcement from the White House explicitly says national security requires US firms to get commercial advantages in countries around the world. That is an enormously broad definition of national security, and requires all of us to rethink how we do think about those alliances. And then couple that with the technology, the acceleration of different ways of payments, crypto, faster payments, fintech. Criminals can move money around the world at the blink of an eye. And actually the reality is that banks, law enforcement, regulators are not currently equipped to sort of keep up with all of that. And clearly the data restrictions obviously play into that. So I think when we think about what does that mean going forward, I think the lesson is obvious that we know collaboration and cooperation works. We know that's critical. We know we need the legislative frameworks, but we also need that sort of operation. But in a world that's changing, in an environment that's changing, we've got to rethink how we do that. I don't know the answer to that question. Hopefully the collective brains could get us there. I think we also need to make sure that as the tech race accelerates, we're all keeping up with that tech race. And how do we invest? How do we use the massive investment that people make in financial crime in a way which is smarter and more effective than it currently is? And how do we be agile to new threats? So I think there is a massive question for us going forward. And I think one of the debates we need to have is actually how do we measure that success, and how do we balance the fact that sometimes we may have to hold our nose to cooperate with people we don't like in order to achieve the objectives. And that's a very, very different way of thinking we're going to have to address.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. And that actually tees up the next question, because if we talk about how important financial stability is to global security and how intrinsically is linked. So 2 questions. One is, in what ways do we think that the regulatory framework, tools, industry at large has adapted to the changing nature of financial crime? And to your point, what more needs to be done? We may not have all the answers up here, but we'd certainly like to tee up that conversation for the rest of the day. So I'd welcome any thoughts on that. So Tracey, I'll get your view on that as well as Sue's. And Sue, also, I think as we're speaking, so what does it look like then in terms of effectively addressing crime, information sharing? What could that look like? And even with the view of, so the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy spoke about an international summit of allies. What does that need to look like? So I'd welcome your thoughts on both of that. Thanks.
So I guess 2 things I would say first of all. One is, on the positive side, I think there has been a significantly increased focus on effectiveness over the past 10 years, and actually particularly in recent years, and a focus on the need for us all to spend less time and energy ticking boxes, chasing innocent people around the system, etc., and really executing and delivering on taking away people's ill-gotten gains and tackling corruption. And the critical elements of that are obviously, first of all, financial institutions stepping up and playing their part, and we've heard some comments and challenge about that this morning, but I think the banks in particular have come a long way over the last 10 years, but actually the banks are not the only game in town and are increasingly a smaller part of the game in town. So we've got to think about how that applies. The legal frameworks are critical, and again, we heard that there's been some progress on that, but it's been slow and a bit like wading through treacle. The area where I actually think there's still a lot more to do is that we need to couple the amount of resources we put into the sort of detection monitoring with actual resources going into law enforcement. If we actually were spending, a fraction of those billions that we spend on compliance on actually having a better law enforcement response, even just domestically in the UK, we would be making transformative differences to the way we're tackling financial crime. So I think there's the next 10 years needs to be the move from the theory, we know what we think works, into the actual practice of doing the stuff that's really, really difficult. I think the second element, moving slightly away from traditional financial crime, is in the sort of resilience space more generally. We have actually seen a huge amount of effort in the regulatory world over the past few years on the whole question of operational resilience, initially driven by cyber, but really thinking much further forward around how fragile the system is to a big player going down for a long time or whatever it is. And so that focus of the regulators, which is driving focus, which I think is very positive within the firms on actual recovery, resilience on cyber and beyond, has been a really important part of that. And I think we see that continue.
Thank you. Sue, any comments from your side?
So just returning us to the trough of despair again, Jason. I think we do have a long way to go. I was looking through some of the old security reviews that the UK has done over the past decade. And actually the key thing that stands out, I know Tom said it was Putin who moved the dial. But actually, political will is a really key factor. And we saw the first time corruption and illicit finance was mentioned was in 2015 in the Defence and Security Review, was because Cameron decided that corruption was like a really serious issue. Then, just before the invasion, we had another review where they were saying, yes, we must tackle illicit finance, financial flows which are being weaponized by hostile states. But then, as Tom mentioned, it went into a kind of dead end where this didn't compete with domestic priorities. And I think that's the key thing we have to recognize as the elephant in the room, is how this balances against domestic priorities. But I think over the last 10 years, you've seen the IMF found since 2016, a 25% increase in the number of flows going to offshore financial centers from the UK. And a doubling of the flows to the highest risk jurisdictions, Dubai, Russia, China, Hong Kong, and Pakistan, and a lot of unexplained flows coming from the Baltics. So that's kind of gone alongside all this ramping up of rhetoric about how much we're going to do. But we've also seen a 44% decline in money laundering prosecutions, 64% decline in fraud prosecutions, and 30% decline in bribery prosecutions. So I think it comes back to your point, Tracey, what is our metric of success and what is the outcome we want to achieve? Because we know that criminal enforcement appears to be being deprioritized. Is that a mistake? Personally, we think it is, and I couldn't agree more. We need more resourcing in law enforcement. But it hasn't been matched by, there's a bit of a spike in asset recovery, and then it's dropped again by 30% in the last year. And you have seen a ramping up in AML fines, but some I don't know, I presume a lot of you read John Cusack's analysis last week, but there's been $46 billion worth of AML fines against companies in the last 25 years, and that, he estimated, represented just 0.13% of the profits they made in 1 year in 2024. So are fines working? Is that the right metric of success, or do we need to look at senior executive liability much more closely? And that's where, we think some of the kind of deregulatory drive that is now coming out of government, in particular in relation to the senior managers regime, is actually quite concerning, because we do need more accountability of individuals. We've seen FCA bans of directors actually declined by 62% over the decade to 23, fines against individuals halved. So we're not getting the individual accountability that will really put this at the centre of compliance efforts. Shall I say something about the summit?
Yes, please, yes.
I'm going to take us from the pit of despair to the heights of optimism. So I think, we've got a really strong political will, which is, being tempered by this deregulatory drive. And I think there is a real opportunity. And I think there's, great minds in this room could work out, how can we make the most of this opportunity to have a summit. The last time there was an anti-corruption summit, we know it drove a lot of activity in the UK, Companies House reform, corporate liability reform. A lot of those measures that were taken off the shelf when Russia invaded Ukraine were from that initiative. So there's a real opportunity here, coupled with the FATF review, to get some really big, ambitious thinking. I think there's a lot of policy appetite for that. But who are we going to get in the room? And how do we make sure that actually their commitments are meaningful at that summit? And it'd be interesting to hear more from Justin about, what we know, that the UAE remains a really, really high-risk jurisdiction. There are pockets of good practice emerging, particularly in the free trade zone, but it's still a major route for laundering of gold from Sudan. How do we get meaningful actions on that table in the summit, and what is the UK going to bring to it? So, obviously we've been a leader on beneficial ownership, transparency, and things like tackling trusts would be key. How do we ramp up enforcement and regulation in an era where regulation is becoming a little bit of a dirty word?
Yeah.
Just to add, though, I know we're talking about the importance of enforcement, but it leads back, I think, Tracey, to what you were saying about we could also get better at the detection in the detection space. And I also think when we're looking at this, it's a UK-wide response is what we're looking internally. So I think there's also more that we can do in terms of harnessing other entities, tech platforms, social media, the telecoms as well, because actually the traditional ways of doing this have evolved so quickly that the only way we can do it is actually have this UK-wide response where we're actually getting all of the intel, all of the information. We have an idea as to what the new ways of thinking and working are so that you can actually gather the information and intelligence sooner so you can take action. So because I think by the time we're taking the enforcement action, the ways of working, the cultural change that you want, how we want to protect people, it may just come a little bit too late. So I also think that there's something about getting in there earlier and quicker and sharing that information and intelligence.
Agree. So there's many ways we can go right now in terms of all of those comments. Let me go back, though, Sue, to the point that you were talking about around deregulation. And so we're seeing news out of U.S. administration, fast and furious in this space. We also have a need and a desire to move towards a risk-based approach. So let's talk a little bit about how do we balance that need for balancing security in a world that is moving towards this deregulation and a risk-based approach. What are the trade-offs? And does that look different for your traditional brick and mortars versus your fintechs? Justin, do you want to give any comments in that space? I'll bring you back in.
Yeah, to be honest, it's a real struggle now because I think with a lot of the VAS that you're seeing, they're sort of borderless. And what I mean by that is they're also still continue on business without being actually regulated. So I have a lot of one-on-one discussions just asking a very simple question around the fact that, where is your head office based? The answer is, it's in the cloud. What is your UBO structure? We don't have one. And so the challenge that we have and we're continuing to have is, especially from a UAE perspective, we're trying to be an innovation hub. So we're attracting a lot of these innovative companies that are actually coming into the UAE. But in fact, people don't realise that in many cases that they're actually not regulated at all. People have a perception just because they're being advertised in a certain jurisdiction that they're regulated in that jurisdiction. But we see a lot of our complaints coming through, which again head to our enforcement team, and we say, well, we've got no jurisdiction over the entity itself. So the trade-off between the fact that the fintechs have amazing technology, you look at their technology and it's phenomenal, but you ask the simple question around how do they onboard their client, in what sort of questions are being asked in regards to them being put on, their clients being put on the platform, and they just can't answer the most simple questions. So for us, we're continuing to be trying to find the right balance between the actual firms themselves, like the financial institutions that are actually within the UAE, and then the more tech-driven innovative firms, and just trying to find the balance on what the requirements are. But the risk-based approach, I think no one has the right answer for that, no matter where you go around the globe.
Thanks, Justin. Andrew, if we look at the UK's focus on the growth agenda, what does that look like from the UK perspective, and your need as a regulator to look at how much risk you're willing to accept?
I think the starting position on this will remain that financial crime will continue to remain unwavering. It has been part of the FCA's last 3-year strategy, and it will continue to be part of our 5-year strategy going forwards. We know that financial crime is absolutely a drain on growth. Not only does it impact consumers, it can destroy individuals' lives, but it also takes money out of the economy and goes straight into criminals. So in relation to that, we know that keeping financial crime out of the system is key to continued growth and enabling a system that can thrive and grow. I don't necessarily accept any assumption that, that this drive for growth will in any way lead to an increase in financial crime. I know there's been a lot of discussion about that. But we also know that markets aren't perfect. We know that we can't, eradicate all risk. And therefore, it's very much how do we achieve the sustainable growth in circumstances where we also need to take greater risk, and it's how do you strike that balance. From a regulatory perspective, the risk-based approach is going to be key and pivotal to that. It's Where do you focus your resources? What is the biggest risk? What has the biggest impact? And really taking the proportionate action in relation to that. And I think that will continue if we look at it. As you say, there's no right way. But I think if you boil it down to looking at the biggest risks, looking at the way in which you can be most impactful, but mindful that by focusing on risks, there is a degree of risk that you also have to take in terms of any unintended consequences for that. And I think so long as we have that discussion and we're mindful of that, I think that's how you have to try and seek to get that balance.
Thank you. Anything you want to add, Sue or Tracey?
So I guess the key thing I would say is that the sort of the deregulation pendulum swings very regularly around these things. And I think we have an opportunity to take everything we've learned over the last sort of 10 years and so around what works and what doesn't work, to actually have a thoughtful conversation about how does regulation, growth, financial crime compliance fit together. We know we waste a huge amount of resources, whether financial or human, energy, on things that don't actually work. And if we could use this sort of, kind of deregulatory push actually as an opportunity to say, let's think really hard about what does work. Let's think really hard about what makes a difference. I agree completely with Andrea. I think a clean financial system supports sustainable growth over the long term. If we could take that time to have that thought process and actually really use this as an incentive to think differently about regulation, I think we could turn the sort of deregulation sort of bandwagon into something actually really quite powerful, to turn it into rather deregulation, more effective regulation. I fear that won't happen, but I'm going to be optimistic for this point.
Can I comment?
Yes, please.
I think, we know the Intelligence Security Committee specifically highlighted light touch regulation as something that was very attractive to a lot of Putin-linked oligarchs coming to the UK. So I think actually, there are, it's not statistics, but there are, strong grounds for thinking that deregulatory agenda does lead to increase of illicit financial flows. And I think that, the Trump project and Project 2025, which is going to be, a complete review of all the anti-money laundering regs, is actually, and using that argument like, the private sector spending far too much money, to actually do compliance. I strongly go with your fear, Tracey, that this may not, if we can channel it to make sure that it does become, what is smart regulation rather than deregulation? What is really going to make change?
And maybe linking that back to the sort of whole question of the finance, illicit summit finance, what could that actually achieve? Maybe what we need to be saying, look, we've all ridden for a long time on the coattails, actually, of the US having been pushing this agenda, whether that be in terms of action that's taken against banks that has kind of forced people to do this, whether it's whether it's around the FCPA or whatever it is. Actually, we can see that right now, if we ride on the coattails of the US, we're going to be going backwards rather than forwards. So maybe there is an opportunity for the rest of the world and for the UK to take a leadership position here to say, okay, what can we do? We have an enormous amount of influence. We have an enormous amount of brain power in the country. And, this isn't about spending less. It's about spending more, or spending money in a more effective way to generate the outcomes we want. Because I think if you look at any of your, myriad of statistics, it's not delivering at the moment. So, as I said, I'll be hopeful. But, there is an opportunity there, and that convening power that we can hopefully use. And you would like to think that there is a sort of appetite in the rest of the world, particularly in some of the emerging markets and developing economies that are really threatened by some of these changes, to say, actually, how can we work? Because if the US isn't going to help, what's the rest of the world going to do?
And I think that's what's so interesting about the summit, is it will be coming from that development angle, and it will be about new partners and how illicit finance impact on those low and middle income countries. So I think that's a really positive.
And I think that's quite critical when you look at the word allies, is being very clear on what that could look like, because some of the challenges that we are seeing may not be in a country that we see as a tradition. It may be a harder country that we need to work with, but really to be able to drive some significant change. So I think that's quite critical. We don't have much time left. And Tracey and Sue, thank you very much. My last question was about what are we concerned about over the next 5 to 10 years, and what would you like to see happening versus what? I think you've both spoken about that. But Andrea and Justin, I'd love to bring you into the conversation to hear your views, and then I'll open up to some of the questions that came from the floor.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk at the moment, there's a lot of focus just on AI and technology and the innovation and how regulators can leverage off that capability. And so what we're sort of struggling with at the moment, if you think about AI and you think about sanction screening and transaction monitoring or anything else, we've seen some institutions bring that into their process. And the challenge with that, it's actually bringing up a lot more questions than answers as part of the process. And what I mean by that is, before, for example, they would come up per day, 100 sanction hits, for example. They'd put an AI model through it. Now it's coming up with 1,000. So we're trying to justify which one is correct as part of that process. So trying to work through what it is. What we're also seeing with the fintechs is this huge reliance on AI around onboarding their clients. They're outsourcing that capability, and so where we've done our risk assessments or our thematic reviews, we've asked the questions around, okay, can we see and obtain that information? And sometimes the information sits outside of their ability to pull it in as quickly as possible. So then there's this delay process, and so there's a lot of reliance on outsourcing a lot of this capability, and so it's not in-house. And so when we ask the most basic questions, we want to be able to get, taking a risk-based approach, but also getting the appropriate answers from the people who are actually dealing with, the clients that are actually onboarding, and that's becoming more and more of a challenge. Everyone thinks that the AI and innovation space is going to solve all our financial crime issues, but it definitely won't. And in some cases, it's actually going to be a lot harder going forward.
So I think linked to that, it's about the safe use of AI.
Yes.
I also think there's something that we need to be thinking about, and whether or not firms we're engaging with are operationally and cyber resilient. What is the impact of the reliance on critical third parties? And I think I'm probably just repeating then more of what you're saying as well. I also think, look, as an industry, we need to be ensuring that we've got the right capabilities within the people we're working with. Have they got the ability to work with tech, data, AI? I think another challenge as well is we talk a lot about data and the use of data and getting data and sharing information. But I also think it's very important to really think about, it goes back to what you were saying, Tracey, about impactful. It's impactful decisions based on that analysis of the data. So it's one thing to get the data, but there's another thing to look at it, get insights from it, and then share it appropriately and act on it so that it has an impact. And I think often we just talk about data, getting it, using tech and data, but it's how can we get impactful insight from that data and use it accordingly.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
I think a big shout out to regulators, actually.
Thank you very much.
Not just because you get attacked from all sides. And it's like an incredibly hard job. And I think actually the independence of regulators and really bolstering, that regulatory power is actually the challenge for the next at least 5 years. How do we make sure that they aren't neutered politically, basically?
So we have some questions from the floor. The first question is, so Andrea has a question for the FCA, but I think it's actually a question more broadly. How do you encourage a risk-based approach and drive a reversal in nervousness across the banking sector?
I'm sure Tracey will already have been asked this numerous times as well. Look, I don't think there's any perfect answer on that. And a risk-based approach is being very aware within your own organisations to what are your biggest risks, what steps are you taking to mitigate them, and where are you using resources so that you can have the most impact. I don't think there'll be any scenario where we're able to say on every occasion, this is exactly what you need to do in every single scenario. And I'm not so sure that that's what you want or need, because you will know your organisation the best, and you'll be able to take the most steps appropriately. I don't know, Tracey, if you've got from being an industry as
So
well?
I think this is a really hard question, whether
Really?
you're sitting on the regulator side of the fence or the industry side of the fence, actually, because you can talk about risk-based approach and everybody agrees
Yep.
with it absolutely in principle, but the very definition of a risk-based approach is that sometimes risks will crystallise and things will go wrong, and then there will either be pressure from, internally, the board, if you're sitting in a regulated firm saying we spend hundreds of millions on this, how can this possibly have happened? Or the regulators saying, you said you were good at this, how can this possibly have happened? So I think there's got to be a realisation that with a risk-based approach comes the potential that risks will crystallise, but probably a more sophisticated assessment on the other side of what are the risks we're actually really focused on. And I think that it's very easy to measure the stuff that's a bit more tick box. It's very easy to measure the number of alerts. It's very easy to measure the turnaround time to do things. So it's much harder to measure what's actually effective in a way which is then accepted both within institutions and within the banks. And Wolfsburg's obviously done work on auditing for effectiveness most recently. That I think would be a very big shift. Actually probably quite uncomfortable for compliance teams sitting in banks, because if you move towards that you're looking at different outcomes. But I think that is the direction if we really want a risk-based approach. And this isn't about saying, we accept a certain amount of financial crime. It's actually saying if you focus resources somewhere you might miss something else, but actually you're doing that because you think the greater good is stopping large-scale corruption in sub-Saharan Africa rather than sort of, somebody who's missed a parking fine in the UK or whatever it is. So I think it's that balance on how do you measure effectiveness that gets you there.
Yeah, and so there was a follow-up question which I think leads to this, but speaks to some of the response that you've just given, which is in the case of a specific financial sanction, how common is over-compliance among private sector actors, and how common is a lax or evasive approach? And I think it's a struggle on both sides for regulators to get it right and for banks to get it right.
So I don't think anybody ever aims for over-compliance, right? I mean, it's not in somebody's commercial interest to aim for over-compliance. But what you do have is a sort of, a penumbra of actually how much is it worth. There's a sort of, to be precisely compliant, particularly with the increased complexity and sophistication of sanctions that have come out over the past few years, to be precisely compliant is really expensive. To be broadly and over compliant is actually much cheaper and safer. So you probably get quite a lot of de-risking to say, actually, we're just not going to do that sort of business because in order for us to do it safely, it's going to cost us this much money, it's going to distract us and so on. So it's not so much over-compliance as actually just taking away the risk by not doing the business, which obviously isn't in the interests of financial inclusion and so on. Lax and evasion, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are lax. I think there's probably less of that than you might get from the sort of media side of it. I think most people do take it seriously, but I think the point Justin made around the evolution of technology and the speed of the way activity evolves means it's really hard for people to keep up. So definitely there'll be some bad actors out there, but probably more just struggling to keep pace with what's happened over the past few years in terms of the sanctions space.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, and I'm debating internally, do I go with the question of follow on from that, or do I just throw something left field? I'm going to go left field, make sure everybody's woken up. So we have a question from Oliver Bowe, thank you. Is the risk in risk-based approach now more of a falling out with Donald Trump rather than that of moving criminal money? We'll let that sink in and then
Say the end bit.
So is it more based on a falling out with US administration, specifically Donald Trump's, a lot of the recent announcements from his side, rather than that being a focus of moving criminal money?
What happens if they're the same? Sorry. Well, no, I mean, seriously, there was a very interesting event at John Heathershaw's book launched yesterday, and there's quite a lot of evidence emerging from Tenor Prelic in the Balkans that actually the corrosive capital and very untransparent funding is coming from Jared Kushner. So actually it works at various different levels, right? It's like if the US does become what some people fear is a form of its own kleptocracy, then how are we going to respond to the fact that high-end UK property is now being sold off to US billionaires? And what will that do? I mean, it's we're in very uncharted territory on that front. But I think obviously your question is also about, are we going to actually kowtow to the US deregulatory agenda? How do you respond if the US literally rips up its anti-money laundering rules as it is threatening to do?
So I think there's a different angle to this. We haven't actually talked about the question of the sort of the weaponization of the dollar system and the way the US has used that over many years, but to sort of influence or reinforce its power. And I think there is a real question as to whether or not the rest of the world, the BRICS kind of experiment will accelerate as a result of the activity here, because people will sort of recognize that actually doing business in dollars is going to be a real vulnerability for them going forward. So there could be a sort of risk to some extent to the US in that. That's not going to make it any easier, any of our jobs in this room. But I do think if you're sitting in a financial institution, you clearly need to continue to worry about the risk that you're actually moving dirty money, because actually it's against the law in every jurisdiction, including the US currently. But it's also something that people do feel sort of passionately about. The risk of US activity, though, is not a risk you can ignore. So it is a risk that boards, whether they be in corporates or banks, will have to be managing to try and stay on the right side of the administration. But I think the bigger risk to sort of the financial system is that it will accelerate these alternative payment rails, whether those be BRICS, whether those be crypto related. And actually that won't ultimately help us in tackling cross-border transnational financial crime.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tracey, Sue, Andrea, Justin. Very interesting conversation. I think we have barely touched the sides on this conversation, but we've got the rest of the day to continue. I'd like to thank my panel again for your participation today. Thank you very much.